Hello, everyone. It's Mr. Harkins. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about population, natural resources, and urbanization. The big questions that we're trying to figure out here is how do human populations grow, and how does this growth affect our natural resources? So let's start off with human population. So birth rates, infant mortality rates, and overall death rates, access to family planning, good nutrition, education, the postponement of marriage, all of this stuff affects whether a human population is growing or declining. When you think about maybe access to family planning, things like birth control and condoms, things that are allowing people to actually reduce the chance of having a child, that's actually going to decrease the fertility rate, right? The birth rates. Um, Parents have more control over when they're having children. Things like women having access to education and careers will also reduce birth rates and people waiting longer to marry. So in some cultures, it's normal to marry and have children as young as 16, 17. In other cultures, it's generally later. So it really just depends where you are. So all of these things affect our population growth. 200 years ago, Thomas Malthus predicted some density dependent factors that would actually affect the carrying capacity of our planet. So if you look at this graph, you'll see resources as a linear growth. So this means it's growing at a steady rate. However, population, as we know, typically grows exponentially. This is something we see in nature, and human population is no different. So what he predicted was that there would be a linear growth in resources, things like food, especially food, but also other resources such as space, habitat, resources such as water. And there will be a point of crisis, he said, where certain population growth will be still increasing, but the carrying capacity will be limited. And that point of crisis is a density dependent factor, as opposed to density independent factors such as storms, fires, heat waves, droughts. Those are things that would reduce population regardless of population size. But dependent factors are access to clean water, air, food availability, but also things like disease transmission, because we know that disease spreads faster in population dense areas. So this is important to understand carrying capacity and things that are affecting human population growth according to Malthusian theory. This is Thomas Malthus. Total fertility rate is how many children are being born per woman who is able to give birth. And so the replacement rate is just above 2 births per woman. That means that a couple will have 2 children, and that's replacing them. And so that is replacement level. If it's above that, then that maybe 2.5 to 3 children per family. That replacement rate is lower than the total fertility rate, which means the population will be growing. However, it can also be beneath, which means the population is not growing as fast. In fact, it could be shrinking. So things that affect this are the age of the first child. The later someone waits to have children, the less children they'll probably have. If they're having educational opportunities, that will affect that as well, meaning that they're more likely to pursue higher education, maybe even a master's or graduate degree, and then even something like a career. And these things will reduce the likelihood of having children at a younger age. Access to family planning, like I mentioned, will also help families control how many children they have. Government policy can also have an effect on fertility rate. Some countries could be trying to have their families have more children, so they'll have tax breaks for the more children you have. Maybe a country is trying to reduce how many children are being born. They can institute something like a one-child policy, like China did in the 1900s. Healthcare and nutrition are also things that are associated with fertility rate. Access to healthcare can make a difference in reducing infant mortality rates. and so can access to good health care and nutrition, right? So understanding populations help us understand population growth. So here's a couple different age structure diagrams. So if you're looking on the left, you'll see something called a rapid growth. This is places like Kenya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. Let me get my laser pointer here. And these are places that have a lot of children being born, as you can see, 0 through 14. And then reproductive age is this 15 through 44. And then this old age is 45 through 85. So you're going to see that this large base is going to contribute to a rapid population growth. Um, Something that's growing, but maybe at a slower pace, would be like United States, Australia, Canada. You'll see a more moderate amount of children. Something that is stable would be zero growth, would be something like Denmark, Austria, Italy. And these are going to be right around zero growth, right around replacement level. You see that people are surviving into old age a little more than they would be in these other countries. And then you actually have countries that are shrinking: Germany, Bulgaria, Hungary. You see that there are actually less children than there are reproductive age people, which means that that population is going to be seeing some decline in the future. And we actually can look at this and talk about demographic transition. So let me move my face there. So you have four phases in this demographic transition model. There is a 5-stage model, but in this class, we're going to talk about the 4-stage model. And so in phase 1, you'll have a relatively low population size and high birth rates and high death rates. And what happens as there's maybe uh, less mortality rates, especially infant mortality, meaning there could be development such as improved healthcare, um, improved economics, access to jobs and education. Death rate is going to decrease. And birth rate will remain high because of that momentum, and population will therefore increase very drastically. As population increases and the standard of living increases, people will start to have less children, and that fertility rate will drop. And then you'll actually find in phase 4, population size is actually relatively high. Birth rates are low, death rates are low, and eventually you'll enter into that negative growth phase where the death rate will actually surpass the birth rate and those populations will start shrinking. And this is where stage 5 comes in, which we don't talk about this in this class, but we are just now as a planet experiencing this next phase. So population scientists are kind of seeing what's happening next. Let's talk about natural resources. So there's lots of natural resources that humans use, and this population of growth obviously will increase our use of natural resources. So there is a cause and effect here. So the more people there are, the larger our global ecological footprint will be. However, there are some lifestyles and societies that actually have a smaller ecological footprint than others. So an ecological footprint, it compares resource demands and waste production required for an individual or a society. So everything from the forest products, the carbon footprint, the cropland, the pasture, everything that is revolving around sustaining that person or that society. People use ecosystem services. There's 4 main kinds. There's provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and then this overall one that supports all of those, known as supporting services. So anthropogenic activities can disrupt ecosystem services, potentially resulting in economic and ecological consequences. What do I mean? Well, let's talk about provisions. So, for example, this soursop tree is a provision. You can eat the fruit. Also, the leaves are medicinal. They have anti-cancer properties. You have prescription drugs that use a lot of plant-based sources. So anything like lumber to build houses, anything that is providing us with stuff we use to live, that's a provision. Regulating services. So these are things that are helping cycle nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and water. For example, tropical forests absorb about 18% of all the carbon dioxide that is added by fossil fuels. Soils are naturally cycling nitrogen, improving um, the soil for our plants that we grow. So these are regulating services that are regulating environmental conditions for us that we benefit from these things. Supporting services. So these are things that are supporting all the other things such as pollination of food crops. So without bees, humans, well, not just bees, but any pollinators. Without pollinators, humans would have to pollinate all of our apple and almond crops by hand, which would actually be very expensive. So these things can be priced out, and we realize that we get all of these services for free from nature. So these are support services. And lastly, we have cultural services. Cultural services are things that we use for culture. So tourism, aesthetic beauty, cultural practices, anything that we're using that is awe-inspiring or aesthetic benefit. So using natural resources comes at a cost. There's this concept known as the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is this idea that if there's a shared resource, people will usually act in their self-interest rather than keeping it for the common good, therefore depleting the resource. The classic example is a shepherd. So if there's a common area where people bring their sheep to graze, um, people are, and no one technically owns it, this shared resource will be depleted because people will be trying to raise the most sheep and depleting this area. So that is a common area that will typically have some sort of tragedy or overuse. So there's some specific examples of this, especially when we talk about fishing. So the oceans and lakes are these commons, and people can take more than what is sustainable. And that's when overfishing comes out. So overfishing has led to scarcity of some fish species, which can lessen biodiversity in aquatic ecosystems and actually harm the people who depend on fishing for food and commerce. It can also lead to natural selection of smaller fish. So after, as you can see in this diagram, after kind of selecting more of the big, hefty fish, the after many generations, you're not going to be finding very many of those naturally because those are the ones that are being taken out through these fishing overfishing practices. So pretty sad news here. There's actually 24.2% of our fisheries globally have already collapsed. So these are unfishable anymore, which could mean they've gone extinct or almost extirpated in the areas where they were traditionally fished. We have another 33% that is overexploited. So that's over half of our fisheries worldwide are either collapsed or overexploited. And then the other half, a third of those, a third of the fisheries are fully exploited, which means they're being taken at a maximum sustainable yield. What is that? A sustainable yield is the most you can take without disrupting their growth and their replacement. So this is all about sustainable yield. It's the amount of a renewable resource that can be taken without reducing the available supply. And mathematically, this is half of the population size or carrying capacity, determined by carrying capacity. So let's say a lake can naturally hold about 200 tilapia. So you would want to only take half of that. So if you're trying to take any more than that, you would be taking more than the sustainable yield. This also can go for other things, not just fish. It could go sustainable yield of a forest. How much timber can you take? How much trees can you cut and still keep that forest healthy and sustainable? Speaking of forestry practices, clear cutting. So clear cutting is this practice that is very economically successful. You can make lots of money by cutting an entire forest down. That's what clear cutting is. But it actually, in the end, is economically disadvantaged because it actually can start to destroy the ecosystem and the watershed, which is what we found out here in Hawaii when we cut down all of the sandalwood in the koa and then had a major watershed issue. So major soil erosion, increased soil and stream temperatures and flooding, and decreased nutrient uptake, which is going to increase nutrients in the stream, such as nitrogen. So forests contain trees that absorb pollutants and store carbon dioxide. The cutting and burning of these trees release that carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide, as we know, can contribute to climate change. So what's the solution? Well, there's some sustainable forestry practices such as reforestation. As you can see here, being able to replant forests that maybe were burnt down through catastrophic wildfire or through sustainable harvesting. Um, Integrated pest management, being able to manage these pests using predators, using ways of cutting down trees that are infected, mitigating the pests that are destroying forests, especially in Colorado and California, but even here in Hawaii, the rapid ohia death. We have sustainable practices that include prescribed burns, because without these prescribed burns, you'll eventually have catastrophic wildfires. And these catastrophic wildfires are very detrimental because they destroy everything versus a very controlled burn, which is more natural and happens naturally. That actually, a lot of the plants in especially California, where these burns are pretty regular, um, they're actually adapted to survive in these environments. And then selective cutting, as you can see, instead of clear cutting, just selecting some of the trees and leaving some of the old growth trees for healthy habitat. For example, some owls in the Pacific Northwest only rely on those old growth trees. Those are the really old, large ones. And so making sure that you have a nice mixed ecosystem can help sustain your forest for longer. Another thing that we want to talk about is mining. Mining can be pretty catastrophic. So, ore is the rock that has whatever resource you want in it, whether it's iron, nickel, gold, even things like coal. These are the things that we're mining for, minerals underground that is must be accessed by accessing ore. So let's take a look at this graph. You have mountaintop removal. This is a type of strip mining that removes all the vegetation and through that actually makes this area more susceptible to erosion. So here's another strip mine over here. So strip mining includes surface mining. Oh wait, no, opposite. Surface mining includes strip mining and mountaintop removal. That's what I meant. Okay, regardless, both are pretty bad. So these areas do have reclamation required, which means that they're required to put everything back as it was before they mined it. But the reality is the area has been so disturbed that it is very hard to reclaim this. You have open pit mines, placer mines. These can actually lead to a great deal of erosion because what you're doing is you're cutting away these stream banks and all that erosion is going downhill. And then you have subsurface mines, which are actually the least environmentally damaging. However, they are the most costly because you have to dig a series of tunnels and they can be quite dangerous. So all of this stuff that they're removing over here and in here is called overburden. So they're removing this stuff to access the ore underneath, and all of this stuff that is being removed, it actually is waste. And so this waste includes the soil and the rocks, and this is all called slag and tailings, and all of this is stored in like pools and lagoons, and these can actually be quite toxic. And there's actually examples of when these have um, basically leaked into people's water supply and hurt people, or these reservoirs full of these chemicals from the mining operations. The dams have broken, flooded, and destroyed towns. So these can be quite environmentally damaging and damaging to people. But the good thing is, I guess it gives us low cost energy and materials to make products. So all the things that require metals, all the things that fossil fuels like oil and coal, makes things pretty cheap, but it can destroy habitats and contaminate groundwater and release dust particles and methane. Those dust particles actually can cause cancer, and methane increases global climate change. So as coal reserves get smaller due to the lack of easily accessible reserves, it becomes necessary to access coal through subsurface mining, which is very expensive. So a lot of the easy pickings are gone, and they're actually digging further and further to get access to those other coal deposits. Let's talk about urbanization. So we know how humans use natural resources and the effects of those. Now people are increasingly living in urban environments, and this is a change. It didn't used to be this way. So the population in the United States in urban areas is more than twice of rural areas. And this has an effect. So one thing is water. One of the number one uses of water in houses and residential areas is toilet flushing. The second is bathing, and the third is laundry. So when people are thinking about, oh no, I drink too much water and wasting water. Well, really, we're flushing drinking water down the toilet all the time. The water in your toilet is drinking water. It's the same water that goes into your sink. So urbanization can lead to the depletion of these resources and something called saltwater intrusion. So as we are using our groundwater, because that's where most people get their water. So we have these wells that dig underground, and this can be at a individual scale, like we had a well growing up on our farm, or a island wide scale, like here, where we have a water system where everyone's connected to a series of wells. But as you reduce the amount of fresh water, you displace that water, and there's a displacement of pressure, which actually can cause the salt water from the ocean to then ascend, and then you actually have destroyed that well, and you have to find a new well. So this is one damage of urbanization and the depletion of water resources. Another is urban sprawl. So urban sprawl is that change in population distribution from cities to low density suburbs that spread into these rural lands that were traditionally forests or farms, but now they have a bunch of houses on them. And this can lead to all sorts of environmental problems that destroy habitats, destroy migration routes. It also can destroy wetlands that are important for the cycling of nutrients. It can also increase carbon dioxide emissions. So, uh, for example, let's say there's more people moving out to the suburbs from the city. This is going to increase traffic. Longer commutes mean more gas is being used. That's increasing carbon dioxide emissions. But also, it's increasing the tax revenues for gasoline, which can also lead to more highway construction. And then better highways and freeways are actually going to lead to more suburb expansions because people are going to say, oh, it's the traffic's not as bad now, or things like that. This is one example of a positive feedback loop that makes urban sprawl happen at a higher rate. Urban runoff is another thing that we should be concerned about because in a natural environment, when it rains, a good amount of it evaporates, but then a lot of it is being infiltrated into the ground, and then 10% is run off into those streams. However, in an urban environment, you're going to see more flooding because you have more impervious surfaces, uh, things like roads, buildings, sidewalks, parking lots that do not allow water to reach the soil, which can lead to flooding. So what do we do? There's a couple things we can do to mitigate or reduce urban runoff. One thing is having rain gardens, such as planting trees, places where this can actually filter into the ground naturally. So this is one area that's planted a rain garden to capture all that rain, waters the plants, but also reduces flooding nearby streams. impervious or permeable pavement, such as these pavers that you can see here, that you can actually create a system that helps drain that flood water, that rainwater, and it's going to decrease the flooding. Another thing is if you are thinking about development, building up and not out is important. So instead of taking that agricultural land that would typically use for a farm, but redesigning an area that is already existing and making that area into, a duplex or a small apartment building um, above a shop. Those are some things that we'll talk about in a bit. Noise pollution is important to understand because not only can it affect people, it can also affect animals. So noise pollution is sound at high levels, high enough to cause physiological stress or hearing loss. This is a problem we're having in urban environments. Sources could be things such as transportation, construction, and domestic and industrial activity. Some effects of noise pollution on animals and ecological systems include stress and the masking of sounds used to communicate or hunt, such as bats who use echolocations. Um, so high predator kill rates leading to lower population of animals to eat and disperse seeds and a decline in fauna. So it's harder to hear for those animals that are trying to avoid prey. But then we also have things like whales in the ocean. Sound is much louder in underwater because sound is something that needs a medium to travel through. So this can greatly affect whale populations. So noise pollution is one thing in urban environments we have to consider. So let's talk about sustainable development. Sustainability refers to humans living on Earth and using their resources without depleting the resources for future generations. So how do we do that? We can use indicators to help us understand what's going on. These indicators could be things like biological diversity, food production, surface and temperatures and carbon dioxide, and human population and resource depletion. So understanding these things can help us build a more sustainable world, especially understanding that people are living increasingly in urban environments. So one thing to consider is public transportation. That's going to help reduce those carbon dioxide emissions. Another thing is how we live. How can we live in ways that are going to reduce the need for transportation and also increase our happiness? Places that foster a strong sense of place and preserve open space, and people are happy and have opportunities to walk, a range of housing opportunities and choices that are made from sustainably harvested materials, recycled materials. So these are the things that we need to consider when we're thinking about developing an urban world sustainably. So the big takeaway here is as human population increases, the impact on natural resources also increases. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate it. Hopefully this helped you learn a couple new things about population, human growth, and how it can impact our ecological footprint and sustainability.